Learn English through stories, C29 PDF. Adopted and modified by Kulwant Singh Sandhu. Contents: 1. Anne of Green Gables. Chaps 3, 4, and 5. 2. Shall or should. 3. Picture dictionary page. Anne of Green Gables. Chapter 3. Red Hair. Next day, Marilla didn't tell Anne about her conversation with Matthew. She gave Anne a lot of work in the kitchen. "Marilla," said Anne excitedly, "I have to know about my future. Please tell me, are you going to send me away?" "No," said Marilla. "You can stay at Green Gables with Matthew and me, but you have to be good." And started to cry. "Why are you crying?" asked Marilla in surprise. "Don't you want to stay with us? Don't you like Green Gables?" "Oh yes, Marilla," cried Anne. "I like it very much. I'm crying because I'm very happy, and I'll always be good." Some days later, Mrs. Lynde came to tea with Marilla. When she arrived, Anne was outside. Marilla and Mrs. Lynde sat in the kitchen and talked. "I think you're making a mistake," said Mrs. Lynde. "You don't know anything about children." "No, but I can learn," said Marilla, and ran into the kitchen. She saw Mrs. Lynde and stopped. "The Cuthberts didn't take you for your pretty face," Mrs. Lynde said. "She's very thin, Marilla, and her hair is as red as carrots. Come here, child. I want to see you." And ran across the kitchen and stood in front of Mrs. Lynde. Her face was red and angry. "I hate you," she cried. "I hate you, I hate you." "Anne," cried Marilla, "you're a very rude woman," and told Mrs. Lynde. "And you're fat." "Anne, go to your room," said Marilla. "Wait for me there." And started to cry. Then she ran upstairs. Mrs. Lynde got up from her chair. "I'm going home now, Marilla," she said. "That child is very wild. You'll have a lot of problems with her." "But you said unkind things about her," said Marilla. After Mrs. Lynde went home, Marilla went upstairs. Why did Anne say those things? She thought unhappily. Now Mrs. Lynde will tell everybody in Avonlea about her. "Stop crying and listen to me, Anne," she said. "You were very rude to Mrs. Lynde. She was a visitor in my home." "But she was very unkind," said Anne. "I want you to say sorry to Mrs. Lynde," said Marilla. "And never," said Anne. "I'm not sorry." "I hate you," she cried. Marilla remembered something. When she was a child, her aunts often talked about her. "Marilla isn't a very pretty little girl," they said. "Maybe Mrs. Lynde was unkind," said Marilla quietly. "But you have to say sorry. Stay here in your room." Next morning, Anne didn't come down to breakfast. Marilla told Matthew the story. "She was very rude," she said. "But, Marilla," said Matthew, "if Mrs. Lynde doesn't think before she speaks, please don't be angry with Anne." Anne stayed in her room all day. Marilla took food upstairs, but Anne didn't eat very much. In the evening, Matthew went quietly up to Anne's room. Anne was on a chair by the window. She looked very small and unhappy. Matthew felt very sorry for her. He closed the door. "Please go and say sorry to Mrs. Lynde, Anne," he said. "All right, Matthew," said Anne. "I wasn't sorry yesterday, but I'm sorry now. I'll do it because you asked me." "Good," said Matthew happily. It's very quiet downstairs without you, Anne. He went quietly out of the room. Later, Marilla and Anne walked to Mrs. Lynde's house. I'm very, very sorry, Mrs. Lynde, said Anne. I was very rude to you. You were right about my red hair, and I am thin and ugly. Mrs. Lynde smiled. I was rude to you too, she said. You do have red hair, but maybe it will change color when you're older. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Lynde, said Anne. Now I can hope for prettier hair. Please, can I go outside and play? Yes, of course, said Mrs. Lynde. Find some flowers. And went out and closed the door behind her. Anne is really sorry, thought Marilla. But she's funny too. She's a strange little girl, said Mrs. Lynde to Marilla. But she isn't a bad child, I like her. On the way home, Anne suddenly put her small hand into Manila's hand. I love Green Gables, Marilla, she said. It's my home now. Chapter 4. The Party. Anne had only one ugly dress from the orphanage, so Marilla made her 3 new dresses. She bought a little hat for Anne too. But Anne didn't like the new clothes. Why don't you like them, Anne? Asked Marilla. They're not pretty, answered Anne. But they're very good dresses, said Marilla. Marilla went to church every Sunday. She wanted to take Anne with her. But the next Sunday, Marilla was sick. Can you go to church without me? She asked Anne. Yes, of course, Marilla, answered Anne. She put on one of her new dresses and her hat and started walking down the road to church. I don't like this hat, she thought. It isn't very pretty. Then she had an idea. There were a lot of beautiful yellow flowers by the road. Anne put some flowers on her hat. When she arrived at church, the other children looked at her. That girl's crazy, they said. After church, Anne ran back to Green Gables. Did you enjoy it, Anne? Asked Marilla. Not very much, said Anne. The minister talked for a long time, but he wasn't very interesting. But there's going to be a party next week for the children of Avonlea. That's exciting. Please, Marilla, can I go too? Yes, of course, answered Marilla. Oh, thank you, Marilla, said Anne. She put her arms around Marilla. Marilla felt happy. I'm starting to love this child, she thought. Marilla had a beautiful old brooch. The day before the party, she couldn't find it. It was on top of the desk in my room, she thought. But now it isn't there. Where is it? Did you take my brooch out of my room? She asked Anne. No, Marilla, said Anne. I went into your room last week. I saw the brooch on top of the desk and put it on my dress, but then I put it back on the desk. I didn't take it out of your room. Marilla looked for the brooch again, but she couldn't find it. Anne, she said, I'll ask you again, did you take the brooch from my room and lose it? No, I didn't, Marilla said Anne quietly. Go to your room and stay there, said Marilla, and went to her room. Later, Marilla went to see her. Marilla, the party is tomorrow, Anne said. Please, can I go? No, said Marilla angrily. Tell me about the brooch first. But I told you about the brooch, Marilla, cried Anne. Next morning, Marilla took Anne's breakfast upstairs. Anne sat on her bed. Her face was white and her big gray eyes shone. The other children looked at Anne. I'll tell you about the brooch now, she said quietly. I took it and I put it on my dress. Then I went outside and walked down the road to the bridge. I wanted to look at the brooch again. So I took it off my dress. It shone in the sun and was very beautiful. But then it fell from my hand, down, down to the bottom of the river. You're a very bad girl, Anne, Marilla said angrily. I'm sorry, said Anne. Please, can I go to the party now? The party, cried Marilla. Of course you can't go. But, Marilla, said Anne, you wanted to know about the brooch, so I told you. Now please, can I go to the party? No, said Marilla, and went out. And fell on her bed and began to cry. Marilla went downstairs with a very sad heart. Maybe Mrs. Lynde was right about Anne, she thought. After lunch, Marilla wanted to go for a walk. She took her coat from the closet. Then she saw something on her coat. It was her beautiful brooch. What's this? Thought Marilla in surprise. Oh, I remember now. I put the brooch on this coat. She went to Anne's room. Anne, why did you tell me that story this morning? She said. The brooch is here on my coat. I wanted to go to the party, said Anne sadly. You wanted me to tell you about the brooch, so I had to think of a story. Marilla began to laugh. I'm sorry, Anne, she said. I made a mistake. Now get ready for the party. Oh, Marilla, cried Anne. Isn't it too late? You know, answered Marilla. It's only 2:00. Wash your face and put on one of your new dresses. I'll give you some food for the party. When Anne came home that evening, she was very happy. Oh, Marilla, the party was wonderful, she said. Chapter 5. Love and Hate. Marilla, said Anne one day, do any other little girls live near Green Gables? I'd like to have a best friend. Yes, answered Marilla. Diana Barry is the same age as you. She lives at Orchard Slope, across the river. I'm going to visit her mother this afternoon. You can come with me. Mrs. Barry was a tall, thin woman. Diana was a very pretty little girl with black hair and dark eyes. She had a little sister, Minnie May. Minnie May was 3 years old. Diana, taken outside, said Mrs. Barry. Anne and Diana went outside and stood quietly by the flowers. Then they started to talk. They talked all afternoon. Did you like Diana, Anne? Asked Marilla later. Oh, yes, said Anne happily. Diana is wonderful. Then Marilla saw something on her coat. Anne and Diana met every day. Sometimes they played in the woods. Sometimes they read books and told stories. Then summer ended and September came. Anne went to school in Avonlea. She was good at her lessons, and she liked the other girls. But Anne didn't like the teacher, Mr. Phillips, very much. One day, there was a new boy in school. He was tall, with brown hair. The girls liked him. That's Gilbert Blythe, Diana said to Anne. His family went away for the summer. They came back on Saturday. Gilbert's desk was near Anne's desk. He often looked at her. He wanted her to look at him, too. She was different from the other girls in Avonlea, but Anne wasn't interested in Gilbert. Gilbert took Anne's hair in his hand. Carrots, he said loudly. Carrots. Anne jumped to her feet and looked at Gilbert angrily. I hate you, she cried. I hate you. She hit Gilbert on the head with her slate, and the slate broke. Everybody looked at her. Mr. Phillips ran to her. Anne Shirley, what are you doing? He asked. Answer me. Anne didn't do anything wrong, said Gilbert quickly. I was rude about her hair. Anne, go and stand in front of the class, said Mr. Phillips. Anne stood in front of the class all afternoon. Everybody looked at her, but Anne didn't look at anybody. I'll never speak to Gilbert Blythe again, she thought. After school, Gilbert tried to talk to Anne, but she walked past him. "You don't be angry with Gilbert, Anne," said Diana. "He laughs at my hair because it's very black." And hit Gilbert on the head with her slate, and the slate broke. "Gilbert Blythe was very unkind," said Anne. The children often played outside after lunch. Sometimes they were late for afternoon school. The next day, Mr. Phillips was in the classroom when Anne arrived with flowers in her hair. "Anne Shirley, you're late," Mr. Phillips said. "Take those flowers out of your hair, then go and sit with Gilbert Blythe." "I can't sit next to Gilbert," Anne thought. "I hate him." She got up slowly from her desk and sat down next to Gilbert. But she didn't look at him. She put her head on her arms. A little later, Gilbert pushed some candy under Anne's arm and took the candy and threw it onto the floor. At the end of the day, Anne took her slate and her books. "What are you doing, Anne?" asked Diana in surprise. "I'm taking my things home," said Anne. "I'm going to study there. I'm not coming back to school again." Later, Anne told Marilla about Mr. Phillips. "I'll learn my lessons at home," she said. "I'll work hard and I'll be a good girl, but I'm not going back to Mr. Phillips." Marilla went to see Mrs. Lynde. "What shall I do?" she asked. "I'll leave Anne at home," said Mrs. Lynde. "She'll get bored, then she'll want to go back to school." Anne learned her lessons at home. In the evenings, she played with Diana. She loved Diana, but she hated Gilbert Blythe. 2. Shall and should. You can use shall and should to ask for advice, offer something, and suggest something. 1. Should I bring an umbrella? 2. Shall I go by taxi, or will it be better to walk? 3. Should I phone the police? 4. Shall I help you with that heavy bag? 5. Shall we go home now? 6. You should try that new Indian restaurant. 7. You should eat fruit instead of candy. 8. One should study hard. 9. What shall I do for you? 10. What shall I do? You should work hard. 11. He thinks we should buy a new car. 12. They should consider the company's new rules. 13. He said to me, I shall appreciate it. 14. He told me that he should appreciate it. 15. Shall we visit Rome this summer? 16. I shall be there by noon, or I will be there by noon. 17. Shall we start a meeting? 18. Shall we go home? 3. Picture dictionary page.